I'd like to call to order the work session Monday, February 22nd, 2016 is now 5 p.m. and we are all present. I know Councilman Stipp is.
He's here.
Can you see us back there that we're starting? Okay, well, he'll get here when he does. I'm going to change the discussion a little bit tonight, so I want to discuss this. I'm not going to actually discuss it. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do, okay? Because we have found that many times staff is unable to finish their presentations because of our interjections and very lively conversation on questions. So from now on, whenever we have staff present us, get your notebooks out, get your pens, and take the notes, figure out where you have to go back to, but we're going to let them finish their presentations. So, okay, all right, so let's go ahead. On 3.1, the council will receive information regarding the Goodyear Branch Library site improvements and public art projects. Mark Flynn to present. I have got a few of them. Regis Reed and, of course, Guyleen. All right, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm Guyleen Oslansky, Arts and Culture Coordinator. This evening, I'm joined with Mark Flynn, the Municipal Services Manager, and Regis Reed, Senior Project Manager. We're going to be presenting about the Goodyear Branch Library, the site improvements, and the public artwork.
Can everybody hear back there? Is that loud enough? I think just make it a little bit louder. Okay.
I'd also like to recognize that we do have Commissioner Laura Cano from the Goodyear Arts and Culture Commission and our branch manager from the library, Erin McFarland, with us this evening.
Welcome.
During tonight's presentation, we'll be discussing the usage at the library. We're going to cover the needed site improvements at the facility. I'll also be providing you some information on the history and an update on the public art project. And then finally, we'll conclude with the next steps with both of these projects. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. The city has truly been blessed by high utilization numbers at the library. We've seen dramatic increases in the number of patrons who are visiting the facility. Highest volume has been a little over almost 14,000 patrons in a given month. And we've seen average increases of over 43% month to month as we've seen utilization numbers at the library. Yes. That also has brought with us some feedback from library staff as well as from library patrons about some challenges that they're having in accessing the facility. Challenges have included components about the high curb and the photo that you see with the mother trying to bring the stroller up over the edge of the curb, and then parking at the facility. As we look at the parking, we have parking on both the north, the east, and the west side of the facility, but that's led to some difficulty as folks are making their way around to make their way to the main entry of the building. Next slide. You can see in this slide that when vehicles are pulling into parking stalls immediately north of the library, without the presence of wheel stops, in some cases the front ends are protruding over the sidewalk, and they're either forcing either those with disabilities or patrons with a stroller or something. In some cases they're either having to go up onto the landscape or they're cutting into the vegetation, either on the sod that's present in some areas or in some of the vegetation that you see a little bit further to the west. The photograph that's on the left is the area where we're targeting several of those improvements. The idea being that as patrons are parking on the east side of the library, which is where we have an open number of parking stalls, they're either having to cut through the vegetation and through the gravel, or they're having to make their way actually in the drive lane of the parking lot. So there's a potential for the conflict with motor vehicles, children darting out into the component, children traveling with their parents and the like, or with strollers, or somebody trying to make their way up into that area. There currently is no depressed path, no ramp to allow someone to make their way up over that vegetation area, and that's one of the improvements that's being considered as part of this work. The implementation of these entry improvements, we believe, will enhance the patron's experience, make it a little bit easier for them to access the facility, but it will also enhance the safety of patrons who are trying to access the facility, give them a better path of travel.
And engineering has worked with facilities and the library arts and culture commissions with these challenges they've experienced. And we've listened to what their needs are and put together a narrative summary in a small exhibit, which next slide will demonstrate. And we've established about a $65,000 budget for this. Those funds will be coming out of the library impact fees. Currently we have in place and can only be used for the library to enhance or improve the library itself. The engineering department will manage the design and the construction of this phase of the work for the improvements. And though when the library was built out, we met all the accessible requirements at that time that building code had. However, as Mark identified, the added patrons and visitors to the library and the parking of the vehicles just makes more sense to provide a better accessible route and more accessible parking. We will be adding some ADA accessible spaces and ramps. We'll be enhancing the approach from the east side, as Mark identified, and buffering the parking lot, stopping the vehicles from overhanging. In this exhibit, it's just a brief outline to kind of give you a visual on what we will be doing with these $65,000. The green area outlined on the east side, northeast corner of the library is where we'll be making the hardscape improvements. The photographs Mark showed you where this is a landscaped area. As you can see, the parking stalls on the top of the picture there, the exhibit on the east side, patrons, again, have to walk through that landscaping to get to the front door or around through the drive lane. By creating this hardscape area, and it'll provide them a direct path of access to that. The two blue rectangles are two additional accessible parking spaces we'll be putting in, and they'll be directly at the front door of the library. The yellow little rectangle square between those two is a new accessible route, and it's actually right where you saw the lady trying to get the stroller up over the curb. That's where we're proposing to put this new curb cut in accessible. It'll provide both accessibility for these two spaces and provide all of the other parking spaces a direct access to the front of the library. The little red dashed lines there are the wheel stops we're proposing, and they'll be spaced appropriately back from the curb itself to stop the vehicle from overhanging onto the sidewalk and impeding the traffic of the pedestrians trying to get there. If you'll notice on the east side, there's another little yellow square. Instead of just doing a depressed curve, we'll make that an accessible ramp also to get in, even though there's no accessible handicap parking on that side of the library. If they do need to park there, they again will be able to transverse without going around through the parking and driving lanes. The little orange square you see more to the bottom of it, kind of between the little red dashes, that just to give you a demonstration, that is the existing ramp that was there when we built the library out and met the ADA requirements, and there's one parking stall adjacent to that.
Thank you, Regis. So now we'd like to move towards discussing the public art, and I want to begin with kind of some of the history of the project. On July 10th of 2014, the Arts and Culture Commission approved the artist Stephen Fairfield of New Media Public Art Collective to design, fabricate, and install public artwork at the Goodyear Branch Library. We then came to council on July 14th of 2014, and council approved a $65,000 expenditure for that project. Once we began the project with the artist, there was some challenges that he began experiencing, and he was unable to produce construction drawings that we were able to approve. Due to this, the city opted to terminate the artist contract, and on March 19th of 2015, we went ahead and purchased the intellectual property and design drawings from the artist for a total of $5,000. The city's intent in doing that was that we had this artist design and we would fabricate and install that work at the library ourselves. So we've been working very closely with engineering on making this project happen. One of the things that engineering has advised that is if we construct this public art project at the same time that the site improvements are done, we do get some cost savings with the economy of scale, and we really do reduce that impact on the patrons because then we're only doing construction at one time at the facility. For the budget, as we did work with engineering, the initial estimates show a budget shortfall of $10,000 for the project. The $10,000, we will be coming back to council on March 14th to request additional $10,000 to be spent from the Public Art Fund. This $10,000, I do want to note, it does not negatively impact our fiscal year 16 or our upcoming fiscal year 17 public art plan. Those funds are available, and they are funds that were left from a carryover from fiscal year 14. In this next slide, you'll notice the picture that's on the right-hand side. Now, that's the final artist rendering of the project, and that was done by New Media. In the depiction, you can see some of the elements that will be included in this project, one being the sculptural seating, also the proposed shade element that's there. Along with the project is enhanced lighting that will be included, which will really add to the environment there because it'll create something different from daytime to nighttime, and it creates a space that can be programmed by the city and the library that's an outside area.
The left side of the drawing, the left side of the slide that you see is a representation of the construction drawing, the preliminary construction drawing that would show how those facets and features of the hardscape and the art project would lay out. To the right side of the drawing, you can see the area where we have the depressed ramp to allow somebody to transverse from the east side parking area up across the hardscape to make their way to the front entry. It also changes the curb line just a little bit on the north side of that vegetative area that would become the hardscape to give us a little bit of a softened approach. The idea being that by creating this broadened space, you have some outdoor programming area, and you're able to prevent folks from cutting through the vegetation. And we're providing a path of travel that allows them to safely make their way across from that east side parking area without the conflict with vegetation or with the gravel. The site improvements really become an augmentation, a benefit to the art feature itself by allowing the platform upon which it can be built.
So just to be very clear on our budget, the first project, the site improvement project, is a project total of $65,000. We would be using the library impact fees to fund this project, and those funds are designated for site improvements at the library. For the public artwork, we do already have the $65,000 that was approved by council on July 14th, and we will be coming back to council on March 14th to request an additional $10,000 to add to that project budget to make the total project $75,000.
By combining the two efforts, we see there's real value in returning this project to the city. The opportunity for us to enhance those primary entry points to the library are certainly an enhancement for patrons who are coming to the library. A safer path of travel, a more direct route for them to be able to traverse to make their way to the entry. The other component of that, though, is that creating the platform upon which the public art can be developed. Increasing the outdoor programming space really allows us to enhance the features and the functionality of the library, while at the same time taking care of those entry concerns that have been raised by folks who are using the library on a regular basis. We're blessed with the increased numbers. We want to make sure that we can respond to the patrons' request and give them a safe way to make their way into the entry.
So the next steps for this project include that we would go out, we'd execute a contract with a contractor for the library frontage improvements. As I mentioned, we'll be coming back to council on March 14th to ask for an additional $10,000 for the public art project, which would be funded from our public art fund. We do estimate that this project could be completed by winter of 2016, and we're very aware of the impact that this may have on patrons, so we've been communicating with library staff, and we'll make sure we are communicating with patrons during the time of the construction so that we minimize what we're trying to do, what's happening to them as they're trying to enter the library. There will be no library closures, and I'm assured that we can make it as easy as possible on them to be able to still use the library during that time. With that, this concludes our presentation, and we'd like to open the floor for council
I'm
comments.
going to open the floor to comments. Anybody on this side, comments? Joanne?
Well, thank you. You know, I appreciate that when we originally went in there with the library, that building wasn't built to be a library. And so I can understand as we've grown and we've understood things that changes have to be made. So I understand that. I guess a couple of questions that I have. First of all, I understand the funding of that we have the library impact fees. What I'm not sure of is, first of all, how much we have in that fund altogether. Secondly, are there other needs of the library that this money should go to? Because parking areas and things like that, where granted they need to be done and we need to find the funding for it. You can take funding from asset management. You can take funding from other places for the library, but needs of the library may not be able to come from other funding. And so that's my question. Am I making sense? Because there may be other needs of the library that funding needs to go to, where we have other pools of money that can take care of a parking lot. So that's my question, I guess. And I don't know how much is in there in the first place. So
Mayor, Councilmember Osborne, we'll call up our finance director, or excuse me, budget manager. I see them both trying to stand up here. And really the need to have them also answer, when do we have to use these development impact fees by? As you're aware, impact fee legislation has changed. So if that could be addressed also by our finance director.
Thank you. I'll answer it in several different ways. The impact fees that we're talking about for this particular project were levied before 2012 when the impact fee statutes changed. And this we're looking at as a completion of the library improvements that we used the 2012 impact fees for. We've worked with Nathan on it. Lori gave me an estimate just real quickly. She's thinking it's about $120,000 total that's in that particular fund. It has to be growth related as how that can be spent. But as we move forward with the library in a couple of years, when does that shift? Next year. That's where Nathan has his eyes on the rest of it, to being able to take care of some of the things that need to happen as it shifts away from completely county and the agreement goes away towards some of our obligation.
So what other examples growth related are there besides the parking lot?
It's a great question. Some of the other items may include a larger sorter. Could be used for increased circulation materials, could be used for new computers. And so the thought when we looked at this approach was, these exterior improvements are critical to the operation of the library. We understand that in, I believe it's July 1 of 17, where we will actually take over responsibility for operating the library. And it doesn't mean that necessarily us doing it, but it will be our financial obligation. And at that time, we would use remaining funds to address any needs that there were going forward, such as a larger sorter because of increased use or growth-related use or increased circulation, things like that.
And what was the timeline again? I'm sorry, Ms. Guyleen said, what was the construction time or whatever?
I believe they're looking at winter of this year.
Thank you.
Molly?
Okay. I'm at the library 3 to 5 days a week, every week, all the time. And I'm talking to patrons, asking them what do they want. They do want the ramps because it is very difficult when there's only one handicap parking spot for other handicapped individuals to park and unload and have to go all the way to the west end to come up the sidewalk. So I appreciate you doing one in the middle and one at the end. That's really critical because a lot of us do park against the east side because that's the only parking available, literally, 9 times out of 10. Truthfully, I'm not in favor of making the budget any larger. I'd rather use the money somewhere else.
Sorry, what did you say? What you're not making larger? I didn't.
The additional $10,000 that they're going to come back to us in March, I'm really not in favor of adding it to this program. But what some of the patrons are telling me, when you go into the library, if you're not familiar with the setup, immediately to the right, in the far corner, there is a study area with desks and chairs and windows. And that's where all of our tutoring people sit. This is where all of our folks sit who are using their own computers and who are studying or doing whatever. And when they look out the window, they see that horrible cactus. And they just say, we would like sometime to have a better view. We don't want our view blocked, but we would like to have some nice vegetation because this is the original vegetation. And it's the opposite end of where this is. And Regis, you know exactly the area I'm talking about. It really is ugly. And they're there sometimes 2 and 3 hours, sometimes longer, but they're looking out at the windows and they just want a more pleasing view if that would be possible. And I would like to see us do something on that end of it, which is really just landscaping, taking out what's there. And now the picture that you show us of the completed project with the trees, of course the trees are going to grow and the trees are going to block our Goodyear Library sign. And I know you want trees there, but 2 years ago it was a wonderful idea. I'm not so sure it's a wonderful idea now. I know we can't undo it, but I'm just not convinced our readers are going to sit out there and read and use that. People come in, they park, they go into the library, and they stay into the library. It's air conditioned. The staff is wonderful and accommodating and very friendly to all of them. And kids are everywhere. If anything, we need more computers. We don't have enough computers. But I don't know about the rest. But I just hope that in looking at making the library more accessible, we also make it more beautiful, because this is the only library we have. And as you can see, it's being used extensively by hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who love it. And they're so happy to have it. And we're happy, they're happy.
Joanne? Did you want to speak?
Oh, no, I've asked my question.
Sherry?
I like the idea that you're trying to basically incorporate another, I guess, area out front. I just have a question about that. It's hard for me to tell in the picture, especially this one with the trees. Is that a solid shade structure, or is it, I don't know what that called, where it's...
I think the image that you're looking at, it had a slatted shade structure.
Okay.
I think we're leaning more to something that is going to be more solid, though, and we'll define that clearly once we get through the design process and we get our numbers in. But that is what you saw in the image.
Okay, so we're probably looking at more like, I don't know if it's a sail or something that's going to keep more of the sun off.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, yeah, because I think that would help people want to be outside. I think if you have it that it's sun, that would be one of my concerns on the concrete, that, you know, you may not want to sit out there if the sun's going down, if it's not shaded. And I don't want to increase costs. I just don't know, because you see a lot of misters on things. Are we thinking of anything along those lines on this, or not, or?
At this time, we hadn't considered that. I mean, I think that once the project was installed, that's something that, you know, the city could look at. But at this time, that's not a consideration for the project.
Okay, so it would, but something that could be added on later if that we find that people aren't using it, because that is one of my concerns. It's very pretty, but I would be concerned how usable is it going to be when it's so hot. Even like now, it's like almost 90 degrees. So I you know, if we could just kind of keep eyes open on that. And then my other question. Well, I have two more questions. Does the Wi-Fi reach out there, or will it reach out there, or is there ability to get Wi-Fi outside?
It should.
Outside the building?
That would be a question that we'd have to check in with IT on. That would be a great feature to be able to have, and I'm sure that we can look into making something like that happen.
And then my last question is kind of like when we were talking about, Nathan was bringing up like long-term. We're not open Sundays now, right?
Nope.
No,
Is that something that those funds could be used when we take it over for growth or not? Would that be considered growth or not?
The answer, are we talking about the development impact fees?
Yeah.
Those have to be used for bricks and mortar, not operations. So there would be restrictions on the use of those funds.
Okay. Well, I think it's a very good plan. I like
Bricks, mortar, and equipment. I'm sorry. Equipment
Okay,
could
so
be part of that.
that could be like Wi-Fi, but it couldn't be extending hours to a Sunday or anything. Right. Okay. Yeah, I personally think it's really good. I think we're going in the right direction, but I would like to kind of keep in mind, you know, the artist has a very nice rendering, but I just want to make sure it's functional, because I'd hate to spend the money and, like what Wally said, you spend this money and then it's not used. So if we could think of ways to make it pleasant and usable, that's why I said Wi-Fi shaded, that would be great. So I really do appreciate that. I do agree 100% with the parking issue. Yeah, I've been there a couple of times and I've seen people with strollers, so I think that's a great idea. You know, you don't think about it. My kids aren't in strollers anymore, so I don't think about it as much. But when you see people struggling, it's like, yeah, we need that. So thank you.
Joe?
I have a few questions. First, the timeline for the entire project. What are we looking at? 30 days, 60 days, 90 days?
For the design and construction, we anticipate being complete in December or so of this year. We say winter of 16. Of course, winter is December 20-something or something like that. We anticipate being complete as soon as we get consideration for it and move forward with it, we'll get a contractor and a design entity on board right away and begin that process.
If I understood correctly, economies of scale doing both projects at the same time saves you money. Did I hear that correct?
That is correct. There's several aspects, mobilization, pouring out more yardage of concrete at a time, more rebar, more material at a time. You get a better price and things the more you use of it.
Will it be the same contractor doing both projects?
That is our goal at this time. We believe in looking at what the artist is providing us, it's absolutely something that a quality contractor can provide to us. There's nothing, it's artistic in the way it's laid out. It's artistic in the lighting and things that are done, but a general contractor should be able to do that for us, and we'll get confirmation of that as we move forward. And it'll be one of the prerequisites when we hire the contractor that they're able to provide this level of construction for us.
So I saw the next step is to execute a contract for the library frontage improvements. Is that just the frontage improvements, or would that be the entire package?
It would be the entire package, the design of the actual library in site enhancements and the art portion of it. Okay. For the design of make the artist exhibits come to life and be constructible. And so we would hire a contractor. We're looking to possibly deliver this with a JOC contract, or they can be the design entity and the contractor. Again, we've got to put some things out there, get some fillers to make sure we've got the right contractor on board to do this kind of work. The initial will be a little time consuming to get started. That's the reason the actual construction won't take that long, but just to get started with the right contractor on board is going to take a little more time to procure it and make sure we've got it right.
Okay, then that leads to my next question on the additional funds. I would assume since you're going to do them both at the same time, you're going to have a bidding process to award a single contractor. At that point, you're going to know whether you're going to need the 10, 8, 7, whatever it happens to be, once the bid comes in and you get a price. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
So as far as coming back for additional funds, when was the additional 10 going to be asked for?
March 14th.
March 14th. So by that time, you're going to know whether you're going to need it based on your comprehensive bidding of both the frontage improvements and because you're doing them both, I'm hearing with the same contractor. Is that correct?
Councilmember Brazil, no, we will not know at that time. I believe Guilene's coming back was to get approval, and of course, if we don't need the funds, we won't utilize it. That was an engineering estimate based on the amount of concrete, the shade structure, the lighting components that going into this, and the $10,000 really is something. The shade structure is impacting us dramatically. As Councilmember Loretano advised, we need to make sure we've got the adequate shade or the space is not usable. So that's kind of the thing that's driving our budget and kind of hurting us a little bit right now. But again, as we go through this and get the estimates in and get the bids in, if we don't need all the money, of course, it never gets used. We return money back. But without the approval to do that, we have to pretty much go on the basis that we don't have it. So we kind of, I can't enter a contract for money that I don't have approved, of course.
No, I understand that, but I guess where I'm getting confused is if you're executing the contract for the library frontage improvements, and the same contractor, because of economies of scales, is doing both projects, isn't it that same time you're going to have a pricing for both projects?
That is correct. Yeah, the pricing will be broken out for the two different projects, for the two different funding sources, of course. We have to do that for the library impact fees along with the library art money. But we won't have that information by March. We won't have the contractor selected and have hard numbers by March 14th.
Okay. So again, to follow up on what Councilmember Campbell was saying is if the 10,000 is not in there, obviously you can't do the project for what's not approved. Then obviously the design, if it does come in needing the 10,000, it won't happen. Is that what I'm hearing? Or it's going to have to be significantly modified to get to that 10?
We would reduce aspects of the artist on the, and I'm speaking kind of for Guilene on this, but just because it's the construction side of the house and design side of the house, we would have to look at reducing certain elements of the artist's vision. And of course, one of the major ones there was the shade structure. So when we approach this, we could approach it a couple different ways, making it that alternate, and we see whether they come in and possibly come back at a later time if that's council's desire for approval of that money, or get the approval of the money, move forward with understanding that that's our budget, and if we again, if we get bidding in, if we come up short, whether it's $10,000 or not short, I'm sorry, we come up less in the bids, whether it's $10,000 or $15,000 or right at budget, there'd be a true accounting of it, and that money would not be utilized and be rolled over back into the fund.
My only concern is just to piggyback on what Council Member Laura, or Vice Mayor Loretano was mentioning, is it has to be functional. So if you cut $10,000 out of the shade structure, where people sitting on that concrete can't sit because it's too hot, it kind of defeats the purpose there. So that's why I was kind of going with this discussion, to see about the 10,000, the cost, what's associated with, because if you're going to save the 10,000 by cutting the shade structure, I wouldn't be in favor of that, because then to me it becomes non-functional. So that's just my 2 cents worth. But I appreciate it. That's what I was trying to make sure, the timing, how this was going to work, how you're going to get your savings as far as doing both of them at the same time, which it sounds like. I think it's important to do the improvements and to dress up that library a little bit. I don't have a problem. This has gone through the Art Commission, I assume, right?
Yes, it
This
has.
is what they have
This
approved.
is their recommendation, yes.
And I'll be the first to admit, I'm no artist, so I always defer to those that have that side of the brain working that mine does not. So I like the rendition, so I don't have a problem with it.
Bill?
Thank you for asking most of my questions, but the only concern that I have about the particular design is this looks exceptionally attractive to a skateboarder.
I'm sorry, didn't get
To a skateboarder.
Oh,
A lot of loops and
right.
yeah, I know we have signs that say you can't skateboard, but this looks really attractive. If I was a skateboarder, I'd be looking at this. So have we taken that into consideration in the design process? Because the functionality piece is really important, but if it gets destroyed in 6 months, then we've really wasted a lot of money.
Councilman Stipp, I agree 100%. I mean, some of the things we've discussed about some ways to minimize people's ability to grind against the edge of those front edges are to either cut a V into that component so there's not a continuous path upon which you can slide a skateboard. I've also had experience in doing that by adding a steel clip to the outside so there's a profile, again, preventing you from grinding against it. Very difficult to stop someone, though, from skating on the flat surface, the concrete, the walkway, those kinds of things. But certainly minimizing the ability for someone to do that on the face of either a wall or on the face of the benches. We've certainly discussed ways to make that a feature of the design so that it prevents someone from doing that, or makes it very difficult for them to do that.
Okay. It obviously isn't. It doesn't show up in the pictures, and I think it's an important element that we've got to keep in mind. And of course, when skateboards don't damage the sidewalk or the flat concrete, that's not the problem. It's the grinding, as you mentioned. The other issue that I had raised earlier was the concern about what if we were to force this into its original budget. And Regis, I think you answered that. The shade structures appear to be the thing that we lose. So, but you did mention looking at different design elements to try to minimize the need for that additional funding from there. This isn't really even a question, because I'm fairly certain you do this in every one of your projects, that you bid it for the people who end up constructing it. If there's an alternative that is cost savings, blah, blah, blah. So I was very pleased to hear that is the philosophy, even with, and I'm going to say, a project as small as this, because we're building I don't know how many $1 million facility for the police department. So this is obviously pales in that. Aside from all that, it's very nice to see that we're going to take advantage of some of the space that we have, make this more of a true library experience rather than a strip mall, industrial park feel. So those aspects of this are very appealing. So thanks.
Sherilyn?
That was my concern as well, was what goes if the $10,000 is not available. But I do want to make one statement, and that is I've always thought that library it's been very challenging to get to. I avoid riding behind cars. I'm one of those people, unfortunately, that has been hit riding behind a car because I had no alternative. People can't see you because you're so low and you don't know they're in there with the cars are way too quiet today. You can't hear that they're running. And I was hit. And at this library, I pretty much could not get into the library unless I rode behind cars. And I'm making that statement not just for this building, but just as we build, could we please kind of have that in the back of our minds that it is not safe for a person in a wheelchair to ride behind cars because people are just not thinking. So anyway, I commend you for realizing that I always looked at that. That's the screwiest handicap parking I had kind of witnessed right there. So it's not just the strollers because it's not really safe for them either. So anyway, but those were the two things, and I think you've answered that. But I tend to agree if we do need more computers and this money can be used. I don't know, you're using art money for this. I'm not really sure we're talking apples and apples.
So there's two separate projects. The site improvements are going to be funded from the library impact fees, and that's a $65,000 budget, and that's going to take care of those improvements. The public art is a separate piece, and it comes from the public art fund. We already have the approved amount for 65. Go back.
Slow.
There we go. So on the public art piece, that's the portion at the bottom. So we have the approved amount of $65,000, which is in the public art fund to use for the project. We are going to be coming in requesting an additional $10,000, and that is also coming from the public art fund, and that will pay for the public art work.
So I guess what I'm saying are those same funds available to buy computers or something, or can that come from that same fund?
No, from the public art fund, that is set aside specifically for public artwork in the city. The library impact fees are for the library improvements and needs and growth.
So that money could be used for that?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I agree with Bill as far as I know. I just had to say that because every now and then I feel like I have to do that. Aesthetically, I think this is such an improvement. And that's what we're doing in the city. We don't want to put up just plain shopping center look buildings. We want to, I have to tell you, this week I had 5 people come up to me to tell me how happy they are with our council, how great the city is running, and all these, they picked little improvements out that we've done. So this city, these people, they want things to look nice. They don't want us to be so penny pincher looking at things. They want it to be pleasant looking. And I think this does. And we talk about people don't go outside here. Yes, they do. I travel all over the valley at meetings, all times of the day. And people, before they go in, sit down on the bench where it is, around the wall, and talk and or on their iPhones.
Yeah, Wi-Fi's huge.
Yeah, it's not like when you think in hot weather. Come on, guys, we got 3 hot months. The rest of it, today was pleasant. Yesterday was pleasant. So we have, majority of our days are pleasant. So we have that really hot 3 months. And with the shade, you're going to find people who live and have lived a long time in Arizona are going to go out in the hot sun with a shade over us. And so I really like it. I like the design. There always is a concern about how big the trees get and what they block out. So I guess that's something you'll have to look at the design. But I think people want something green in the area to look at because we're not going to have grass. And so if we take the green out, we're taking out the part of the great look of it. So I'm very pleased with this. And especially the shade area.
Thank you, Mayor Lord.
But first, I just want to end. Safety is really important. Okay, and I totally agree with Cheryl Lynn says about that, and also for the children. So, in strollers, yes.
One more
yes,
question.
Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. Was the original design without a shade structure?
No, the original design always had a shade element in it.
Well, then how come it's $10,000 more if the original design had it in there?
The original design was proposed by the artist Stephen Fairfield of New Media. At that time, we had what his proposal was for that design. Now that we've taken over the project and we've gone through and done our initial costing for this, it is showing that we would have a budget shortfall for that.
Well, but so he designed something more than $65,000.
I believe so, yes.
Well, how can we not let this happen again?
That's a very good question, and we've been working with engineering, and we have some new processes in place to help us out at the beginning of this when we go through the artist selection process to really ensure that we have our budgets and visions and everything's in line before we go forward with a project with an artist.
Yeah, because honestly, when you come, if any staff comes to council, we know you've done your due diligence, and when you tell me it's $65,000 and I say, great, I'm all for it, and then I don't like you coming back and saying, but we need 10,000 more because we didn't do this or we didn't do that. So maybe if when we go out for bid or when we talk to these artists, we emphasize it has to be within whatever the amount of money you have said you have to work with. I mean, we can't, it's just really difficult. But I would like to ask Regis a question. Regis, I know this is really awful and this is probably not what you wanted to hear. But when you put the ADA ramp right in the middle, are you going to be able to do something and make sure that drain is properly covered forever and ever so I don't have anyone else fall in it? Please?
Councilman Campbell, that is actually part of the project. Take all those drains and go over them with grates and pipe them out to the parking lot so there are no more tripping hazards.
Oh, thank you.
That's part of our site improvement project.
Well, our Jehovah Witnesses sit right there, and sometimes when they move their chair, they almost fall over, and it really makes me nervous. So I have to talk to them.
That entire area will be hardscaped also along with this project.
Thank you. And one last concern is the renderings are gorgeous, but if we're going to put a seating area out there, mothers with children are going to be out there. Let's not have any cactus so the kids get hurt.
That's one of the things we're looking to do is eliminate the cacti vegetation around there.
Everything else is wonderful, but the cactus, little kids seem to get into that. So thank you.
I have one more question. So the additional money at a later time will do the interior once the county starts moving out of the right, and we'll be doing the interior.
Oh, that's Nathan.
Will we be adding anything? And the reason I'm saying this, I went to the opening of the Buckeye Library.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
They call it Coyote.
Oh.
And I would really appreciate every council person on this dais would go look at this. It is gorgeous. It's creative. It's colorful. It's just, were you there for that? I didn't remember.
Oh, it's
Well,
amazing.
then
It's amazing.
I would love staff to go out there and look at that because it really is quite unique. And it probably has a cost to it, but it was very, very well done. So.
Sure. So we'll be evaluating the needs as we move forward here with additional improvements related to growth for these funds.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation. Appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next one. The council will receive information on the 5-year financial forecast for the general and the sanitation operating funds and for the major capital projects fund sources. And of course, Lori, budget and research manager, will present.
Hello, we're here for the first work session of the fiscal year 17 budget process. And before we started, I wanted to let you all know that I have a brand new team who started about 3 or 4 months ago. Oh. And just let you know, they're sitting back there, Mary Kay, Brian, and Caroline.
Welcome.
So we're all learning as we're going through the budget process this year, and they're doing a wonderful job. Alrighty, so today we're going to be going over the 5-year forecast for the major funds and the capital funds. This is kind of setting the stage for the upcoming budget process, getting you an idea of what the environment's going to be looking like. Today we're going to review the general fund forecast, 5-year forecast. For the first time, we're going to break that forecast into the ongoing and one-time portions for you. We're also going to be looking at the sanitation fund forecast. And then again, also for the first time, we're bringing you a capital funds forecast for the impact fees and for the GO bonds that will be available potentially. What we're not doing this year that we did last year we're not looking at the water and wastewater forecasts. They've just completed a rate process that was, we spent a great deal of time working on those forecasts. There's no new information yet. This month, or January is the first month that the new rate went into place. So at this point in time, we wouldn't have new information to share. So for the sanitation fund, kind of the key assumptions we used in the forecast is we assumed revenue is going to grow about 4% per year. That's what our account growth is in that particular fund. In terms of expenses, it's a little bit, this is a pretty straightforward fund, but we have some things coming up in the 5-year window that make it a little bit different this time around. So I thought I'd start by letting you know, essentially the contract that's currently with Waste Management to do the contained trash collection is 80% of the budget for that particular area. We do expect the contract rate will be decreasing for fiscal year 17. That's primarily due because the contract calls for adjustments to the rate for CPI or an inflation measure, and also for fuel cost changes. And so we will be experiencing the impact of the fuel cost reduction. And so we're still evaluating what that rate change will be. We're expecting a 40 to 50 cents or about a 3% reduction in the rate relative to that piece of the puzzle. The other thing that will be changing in fiscal year 17 is that the contract calls for us to take over responsibility for the containers that are used in the program. If you'll recall, in this year's budget, a position is being added later this fiscal year to start prepare for us to take over those containers. That the contract calls for a reduction of $2.10 related to that change, but that $2.10 will also needs to be calculated through these indexes of inflation and fuel, so we don't know exactly right now what that change will be. So then for the balance of the forecast in terms of expenditures, when we've adjusted for these changes next year, we're basically assuming that the growth in expenditures will be in the contract will be about 7 to 7.5% per year, which essentially takes into account fuel and inflation as well as account growth. In terms of what we're assuming about the container program, at this point in time, we're still evaluating the potential cost in terms of how many containers will we have to replace per year, and what will it cost us to pick them up and replace them. So right now, for the purposes of this forecast, we're assuming that whatever our contract savings will be related to that container change, for now in the forecast, we're assuming our expenditures will go up by the same amount. That is not likely how it will end up in the end, but for forecast purposes, we're taking that conservative position. The other cost assumptions in the forecast, we've built in the vehicle and technology hardware dollar amounts per the asset management plans in the fleet and technology departments that are due for sanitation. And then the remaining part of the budget, we assumed a 4% growth. So this shows you our forecast. The first two columns are the current year, just updating that for the changes that we have from budget. Essentially, fund balance was a little bit higher, we had expenditure savings and revenue increases last year, and then a little slight adjustment to the contract and some of the other costs, which would give us a beginning balance of $1.5 million for next year. So if you look across, so essentially we have the resources on the top, beginning balance, and essentially the contract or the revenue from charging fees to our customers. In the expenditure part, essentially the contract. And when you look at the second row, which are the other costs, which would be the staff and our operating costs, in 18 and 19, those costs jump up a little bit. Those are years where there's some vehicle replacements of $300,000 and $200,000 in those 2 years. And then I'm showing where we're making the same assumption about the cost of the container program and how much our costs will reduce. So across the bottom, you'll see that we're forecasting that we will continue to have a positive ending balance in the sanitation fund through the forecast period. So that from that perspective, the fund is looking sound without making any changes at this point in time. So kind of the highlights are, we are continuing to look at this container-related piece of the puzzle. One of the things we do want to, and we'll be monitoring that and developing that, The containers have a 10-year life expectancy, and they are at the 10-year mark in terms of of when this program will be coming to us. So that's another reason that we're kind of assuming our costs will be equal to our savings in the contract, because we may start experiencing higher container replacements. And we're working with the sanitation areas, working closely on developing that. In addition, in this forecast period, the current contract will expire in June of 19, so there may be change in the program. But the overall message from this forecast is that a rate change is not imminent based on what we see today or needed in the near future. But that will depend on what happens with this actual container program when we take that over. If there are supplemental needs that come forward through the budget process that need to be addressed in the program, and then also what that contract might look like when we get to fiscal year 20, what happens when we go out and reconsider how to deliver that service. But that's kind of the gist of what we have to say on sanitation. So next I'll go into the general fund forecast, which I mentioned earlier. We're going to do an ongoing and a one-time piece of the forecast. I'll start by giving you some information on our current estimates for fiscal year 16, the year we're in now, because as you know, the ending balance for this year becomes a resource available for next year's budget. So our revenues were updated based on 5-month information, or the initial estimates were prepared based on 5 months information. We did a quick look at some of the larger line items at 6 months, and we've just recently received 7-month data. So we'll be looking, so again, these numbers will change. This is just an early estimate for the forecast. But essentially, we're projecting that revenues will be 3% or $2.4 million above the budget for the general fund. The bulk of that increase is coming from development-related activity. Part from the construction sales tax, we're forecasting will be $1.1 million higher than the budget. And then the development-related revenues that are collected in engineering and development services are also looking like they're going to come in about $1.4 million over budget. As you've been seeing in the sales tax reports, the non-construction sales tax is lagging slightly below budget this year, so it's about we're forecasting about $300,000 below budget based on where we were 5 months ago. In terms of the expenditure side, for now we're assuming just a 2% savings in the operating budget piece of the puzzle, the O&M. We're assuming that one-time costs, either in the CIP or one-time capital or one-time supplementals, will be fully expended or carried over into next year at this point in time. So there would be no savings in that particular area in the forecast. This year's beginning balance was about $8.2 million higher than we had budgeted for. That was due primarily to operating budget expenditure savings, and revenue was up about $1.5 million. And in addition, there were some developer deposits that were not included in the budgeted beginning balance. With those changes, we are looking at the ending balance for this year being $28.7 million. The bulk of that is the $16.6 million contingency that is not spent. It will become available to fund next year's contingency. So that kind of sets us up for where we are this year. In terms of the assumptions that we're using for the general fund forecast, we're continuing to assume that the contingency policy will be followed, which is essentially the first 3 months of O&M costs. We've reflected the CIP as it's currently adopted. We are reflecting the ongoing practice with regard to the PIC set-aside, and then also the debt, looking at using the debt schedules based on currently issued debt. And that we're assuming that we'll continue to maintain the existing asset management reserve at the funding levels established in this year's budget. With the one exception, we've established pavement management at $3 million per year. There's 2 years in the CIP where the full $3 million is not present, and so in those years, because we're using the adopted CIP, we did not correct for those particular items. in terms of kind of the revenue and expenditure assumptions, we're going to show you a range forecast instead of just picking a number, because what all of us know is everything I'm telling you today is wrong. Everything I'll show you today is wrong. It won't be factually correct. So what we thought we'd do is actually kind of start by talking about a range, and maybe we'll be within the range. So in terms of non-construction sales tax, our range is on the low end is as low as 2% and as high as 3%. On the high end, it's as high as 6%. Basically, we looked at economic forecasts and kind of followed some of those patterns and looked at our historical experience as well. In terms of construction sales tax and development related, we kind of continued our current practice of, at least for next year, assuming that we would drop from this year's relatively high levels. So on the low end, we're assuming we could reduce that revenue by as much as 15%. Then from there on, rather than continuing to drive it down year after year to 15% a year, we just went to a zero growth on the low end, and then we used 5% on the high end. And even though we're doing a ranged forecast and we're saying there's a high and a low, the high is not high as it could potentially happen. It's still a conservative low and a conservative high. The low is fairly low. In terms of the property tax, we're assuming the standard 2% per year growth in the levy plus the tax that would come from new properties. That's an existing practice or existing policy. Other revenues, essentially, we've grown from 0 to 2% to essentially kind of follow population growth. And then for O&M expenses or the operating budget, we've assumed 2% growth to 4% growth. 2%, just to give you a sense of where that might put you, 2% next year would basically cover the cost of the current MOU agreements. So that's kind of where we bottomed it at 2%, because we know that those are already agreed to amounts. So this chart shows you the ongoing funds portion of the forecast. So we've excluded the one-time construction sales tax and the one-time portion of the beginning balance. And so from here, essentially, we can pretty much just focus on the bottom line. We're forecasting the amount of available resources for potential supplemental purposes or to address other needs as we go through the year and really begin to clamp down on where the budget needs to be. So as you can see, for next year or for developing the FY17 budget, we're projecting that there could be $5 to $8 million of funds available. When we get to the out years, it gets as low as perhaps nothing to $3 to $5 million. And I'll remind you that what you do in FY17 will impact those future years. If we increase our spending on an ongoing basis, it'll change the numbers for the subsequent year as well. And then again, just to remind you, these are conservative estimates, and again, they're wrong. The next slide shows the forecast for the one-time funds that we would suggest may be available in the future. For fiscal year 17, the number is higher than the other years because we know a little bit more about how FY16 is going to end, and so there's a little bit more available in terms of the fact that we had a higher beginning balance this year kind of falls to the one-time funds. And then we're also taking advantage of the 2% savings that we're expecting in the base budget, or in this year's budget, also falls to the one-time part of the puzzle. So you're seeing here where we've moved the construction sales tax is shown here rather than with the ongoing funds. So this is the forecast for construction sales tax. I should go back. I missed something important in this slide. I apologize. The PIC set aside in the debt section, you'll see that in FY17 there's $3 million, and then in FY18 there's $4 million. So that's this ongoing practice we have of building up our capacity to handle the PIC set aside. Those resources then go to the one-time program to be expended. You'll see that in FY19 there's no longer a PIC set aside number, but you'll notice that the debt number has increased. And so that's the year when we start picking up the new debt, and we would discontinue the set aside because we will be taking care of the debt that we've been building to be prepared for. So back into the one-time forecast, that's why there's only 2 years worth of PIC set aside as a resource to the one-time forecast. And so what you see here is essentially the adopted CIP and the asset management program that we mentioned. That's fund the parks, the fleet, and the IT hardware essentially represent that $4 million number. In terms of the CIP, just to give you an idea of why some of those numbers are a little different, in FY18 there are a couple of streets projects that appear in that year, and that causes a bump up there. And there's a little bit more money allocated to the recreation center that year. But that is the adopted CIP is what's reflected in those numbers. And so again, here you'll see the forecast. Essentially, much of our one-time money comes from the ending balance in the prior year. So because we're being conservative about trying to estimate what the ending balance might be in 17, there's only $3 million to start each of the next years, which for the purposes of this forecast doesn't show much in the way of additional one-time funds beyond what is already programmed and planned. Obviously, those numbers will change, and just because something is programmed doesn't mean the council can't change it as we go through the budget process in the future. And then I just thought I'd go through some of the demands on those potential resources that may be available. I mentioned the MOUs already. We'll have to remember as we develop the CIP, some of those projects will have operating costs. So when we spend the one-time money to build the project, we have to plan to spend the ongoing money to operate that. And when we get to the point where we're ready to start talking about funding CIP operating costs, we can approach it in different ways. One would be to just plan. We could start throwing into the forecast. Here's the year we think this is opening, and this is how much we think it'll operate it, and plan it out in the future. Another way would be to do something similar to what we're doing with the PIC set aside now, where we could look at the 10-year CIP and say over the next 10 years, here are the operating costs we think might be coming on, and we could spread that out over the 7 years to X till X is on, and 5 years till Y is on, and come up with an annual amount that we could start setting aside to build up so we'd be prepared for those operating costs when they come on. We didn't show any operating cost in the 5-year forecast that I just reviewed with you because the current CIP doesn't include any projects that would bring on new material operating costs in the 5-year window. The other items that may demand the resources are, I mentioned earlier that pavement management is not fully funded in the current program. In addition, there are other asset management areas being reviewed. We're currently looking at police and fire needs, as well as IT software that was not addressed. We just addressed IT hardware. Those items we hope to come forward in this year's budget, in the FY17 budget process. And then after that, we'll be looking at facilities in a subsequent year. So there are still areas out there to be addressed. There's inflationary pressures. And then there will be other operating costs that we need to address to support population growth that don't go hand in hand with capital projects. Costs will simply, eventually you need to add more things to be able to support population changes. So that's kind of a high-level summary of the general fund forecast. This piece, we again mentioned earlier that we haven't presented you with capital funds forecast before. Last year we talked a lot about what we had to do with the impact fee program, but we didn't bring you the forecast. So I thought I'd start by just reminding you how the existing CIP is funded. 64% of the CIP is funded by impact fees. So it's the major piece that goes into the program. Another 22% is from operating funds, about 15% is general and 7% is enterprise. 12% of the current CIP is from GO bonds, and then the rest is 2%. It's things like developer contributions. So just as a reminder about impact fees, there's a 10-year plan that was adopted per state statute, and per the statute, we need to complete the plan. We're obligated to complete the projects in the plan. There are strict statutory provisions on that it must be the projects that we plan for. The dollar amounts are fixed, and they have to stay within the geographic area that they were planned for and that the fees are being collected in. We have impact fees for streets, fire, parks, police, water, and wastewater currently. We mentioned earlier tonight, you talked about library. There's no longer an impact fee for library. That changed along with some of the statutory changes. And in terms of impact fees, the revenue development basically drives when the revenue comes in. And so until there's development, there's no revenue and we can't move forward with the projects. But eventually we do have to complete the projects. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through these slides. I'll orient you with this one. Essentially, the new impact fee program became effective in August of 14 or 14. And the blue line represents last year's actual permit activity in the north impact fee area. The orange, the part orange, part yellow line, the orange portion represents what's happened so far this fiscal year. The yellow portion represents what our current forecast is for the balance of the year. And then the faint green line represents when the plan was adopted, what the assumption was about the number of permits. So this is for single family permits or EDUs. And so this kind of gives you graphically the sense of why we had to reduce the revenue estimates last year. And it basically shows you, at least in the north area, we're not yet achieving the level that was planned. So the graphs are a little different here and there. Here's the central area. Again, much of the time is spent below the green line. Last year, near the end of the year, it crept above. In the beginning of this year, it crept above. It was above, but then it dropped below. And so then the green line represents the original forecast. And then in the south area, we haven't yet gone above the planned level. So the message here is we aren't really materially changing the forecast for the impact fee revenues. We also we're using the home activity or the home permitting as kind of an indicator of growth in general. There are commercial revenues that come in from impact fees. And we did review that, and in both the central and the south, it very closely tracks what's happening with the home building. In the north, the commercial is doing a little bit better than the home building portion, but not enough to materially change the revenue forecast either. And so just as a quick reminder, we just wanted to remind you about what projects are in the CIP using impact fees. In fire, there's 2 stations, one in the north, the central area, and one in the south, and then there's also apparatus. In parks, there's 1 park in the north central area, and again, those are 30-acre parks is the maximum in the impact fees. And in the south, there's just developer reimbursement for the park for the developer constructed park. In police, there's 23,000 square feet of building. Some of that's going up now, and then they also have vehicles. Streets has the most projects, and the reason I list these is without changing the revenue estimates, there's not really much opportunity to advance projects at this point in time. You might be able to do something like advanced design of a fire station or something like that. Streets has a few more projects, so if there was a desire to swap one project for another in the same geographic area, there may be a little bit more flexibility in the streets program. And then water has a number of projects, pretty straightforward in terms of what they do, and similar thing in wastewater. So some of the challenges and opportunities, some of the projects in the impact fee portion of the program are underfunded or will require financing. There was no inflation assumed when the last plan was developed. And in some projects, for example, like a water plant, the full cost will really take, say, 20 years of growth to really pay for it. But you might have to build that sometime before the 20 years is expired. So in some cases, we're only looking to recover 10 years worth of the cost, but may have to build the project now and pay for the rest of it later on. And then there has been at least one advancement in the program already. We did a general fund loan in this year's budget to advance a street project. And so those things will have to be paid back. And that's the next point, is the general fund repayment from streets. So again, not really any major opportunities to change that program at this point in time, other than perhaps in the streets program to do some swapping of projects within a single area. Last piece of the forecast puzzle. We've talked about the GO bond program at the last two of the retreats. We have gone ahead. We got the property tax information from the assessor on February 10th. So we quickly updated the forecast. We used the combined rate of $1.735 based on the conversations previously. We're assuming that we want to maintain our bond ratings. We're assuming that we can issue bonds the year before the debt service would first have to be paid, because the debt service is the property tax. You can issue bonds and start your payments the next year. And then we've assumed that we'll sell bonds every other year. It's probably not practical or feasible to sell bonds every single year, especially if some of the years have smaller dollar amounts involved. And what you get is that in FY17, which would be for the budget we're developing for next year, we believe we'd have $9 to $10 million in capacity to do GO bond funded projects. And that is fairly certain because we have the assessed valuations, and we already know that there's some existing debt that will be falling off in this time frame. So we're confident with our capacity to handle that issuance of debt. The next two are dependent on what happens with assessed valuation. The information we did get in February 10th, we had previously been assuming about a 3.7% per year growth in the assessed valuations. It came in lower than that, so we've revised our estimate down to 3% for the balance of the program. Remember that we're just completing our second year under the changed rules with regard to assessed valuation, which limit growth to 5% per year. And then we've set new construction at $20 million a year in the forecast that is supporting this. So for fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 21, which would be 2 years after each, assuming that we achieve those assessed valuation forecasts, we would believe we can issue to $20 to $22 million in a GO bonded debt in fiscal year 19, and another $9 to $10 million in fiscal year 21. And then the last piece is just to remind you of the next steps in the process. We'll come back March 14th to talk to you about the CIP and CIP projects, to review what was requested, and to talk about things that might be eligible to fall within the general funds and the GO bond funds. March 21st will be compensation and benefits. The 28th, we'll talk about the supplementals, the one-time and ongoing supplementals. April 4th will be a final review of kind of all this expenditure stuff we will be talking about in March. April 18th, we'll bring you the draft budget. And then if needed, we'll have another discussion on April 25th. And then we go through the routine adoption of the tentative, the final, and the property tax in May, June, and July. That's all I have.
Thank you. All right, I'll start over on this side. Questions? Yes, Bill.
Thanks. I wasn't here for the very beginning, but I did hear through the grapevine to hold the questions until the end.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. I'm glad you came in later, and so I just assumed your neighbor might have told you.
Actually, it was the neighbor on this side.
Oh.
That told me. Anyway, I didn't tell him. Yeah, he didn't tell me anything. He was letting me embarrass myself. Anyway, so going back to the sanitation fund.
Yes.
Now, if I may, when we have a presentation like this that go sanitation fund, and then we break and talk about something completely different. I don't know if that's the time to ask a
We
question.
can consider that. We're
Yeah.
going to try it this way to see how it went tonight because, Bill, you weren't in here. But
Yeah.
the reason that we decided to change it is because our questions are so long that they leave. They don't have the time to finish their presentation. So the information we never get. So,
Oh, no, I totally get it.
but I can see as this went tonight that
Yeah.
there's a possibility of stopping.
There were
in
natural
between.
breaks in this.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So back to the sanitation, which I see you did. The container replacement. You said they've got a 10-year lifespan, and we're coming to the 10th year now.
Yes, that's my understanding. Yeah.
And of course, our frame of reference, especially when we talk about trash containers, is what's happening in our own home. I look at my trash container and I say it does not need to be replaced.
Mine doesn't either.
Yeah, and I'm looking around at most of my neighbors, and they're all in fairly decent shape. But I know how government works, and when we say we're going to replace it, we're going to replace it whether it needs it or not. So the question I have is regarding a container replacement plan. Do we have one, or are we just identifying that we're going to need to start replacing them?
If I could answer that, because I wanted to clarify just a little bit also what that 10 years is first, and then I will get to the part about the plan. That 10 years is actually not, what it really is that's the original warranty that came on. So all of the cans for this past 10 years have been under warranty if they've fallen apart. Now the warranty for the first wave of cans that we implemented when we went to these cans are gone. So there will be an increased expense that Waste Management today hasn't had just to replace those cans. Now, to the second half of your question, there absolutely the sanitation staff has been working on plans and a structure as to how that replacement is going to take. The position I've been taking on this for quite some time is in the long term, because this is what was written into the contract, and it was really what was bid originally 10 years ago, which tells me that that's a private sector cost of doing business for the program. And so I'm very reluctant, even though original forecasts say we can do it for less, I'm very reluctant to set aside less money on kind of a wish. So that's been, that's kind of on me and under that philosophy, if that helps answer your question.
So let me rephrase it the way I think I understand it. If we have 50,000 containers, and we plan to replace them over 5 years, you're going to budget to replace 10,000 containers a year for 5 years.
But that does not mean we will replace 10,000 containers.
Correct. But you're going to budget conservatively.
Yes. And under that scenario, we would, yes.
Which affects the future budgets because
right.
Then we don't need to add that money to it. So,
yeah, it's a yin and yang.
It's to keep it stable.
Okay. That was the only question that I had on sanitation, but I do have other questions on impact fees. So I don't know if we want to advance through or.
Well, I can ask anybody have anything on sanitation. I think you should finish your questions up.
All right. Then the next one was on the revenue projection, the revenue updates. The projection, I think you said, was a 3% increase in revenue for this year. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
The MOUs are 4%. Anything over 4, we have to go back in.
I believe it's anything over 5. It's 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and then 7 and above.
Okay, and that was that. The next, no, that slide right there. The 8.2 in the third bullet.
Yes.
That's essentially new one-time projects for FY17, correct?
Correct. That's new one-time money.
Okay. And then I think it was the next slide. I think so. Anyway, we talked about, you talked about the ongoing costs for a CIP project that would become O&M.
Yes.
And the example that came to my mind right away was the whatever we're calling it. I'm going to call it a rec center.
Recreational
Yes.
multi-gen building.
So the rec center, when we build it, it will have an operating cost
Correct.
going forward. Is there a philosophy that perhaps when we discuss building it, that's the time to talk about the O&M? I got a kind of a mixed message, so I was looking for some clarity on that.
Council member, as we develop the CIP, we do request an estimate for the operating cost. And so as we come forward with the CIP where projects have material operating costs, we will be identifying those in this process.
And we'll hear that at the time we say, yeah, build it?
Yes, that would be my recommendation, and that would be my
that would be mine too. But
that would be, and that was
We're
part of
assuming
the
that is
that
your
was part of the
recommendation.
reason of highlighting it here, so that you would know when we come forward that we need to talk about both the operating costs and the capital projects at the same time.
yeah, and just a frame of reference, I worked recently in a number of communities that are going out of their way to build things and that have no capacity to operate them, and now are finding themselves 1, 2, or even 5 years later with a budget that's wiped out because they couldn't do it. So I'm glad to hear that we're doing that ahead of time. And speaking of that project, you made the statement that there is no project in the 5-year forecast that has that effect, but I thought the rec center is in the 5 years after a retreat or two ago.
The adopted CIP has funding for the rec center spread out over a number of years. And so if you assume that you can't open the rec center until the last year of the funding is available, it wouldn't open in this 5-year window.
I thought at the last, I don't know when it was, but when we talked about changing to increasing above the $1.60, that pushed that project back this way in the calendar.
You're correct. That is the conversation that we've had. But in this forecast, we're presenting you the CIP as it was adopted
A year ago.
a year ago. When we come to you in March with the CIP, that's when we'll be talking about advancing projects and the operating costs that would come along with those advancements.
Okay, so I'm just early on that one. Okay, got it. And then the last question. Nope, 2 questions. Can we build something that is supposed to be, that we're supposed to use impact fees for? And I think I already know the answer to this, early, and have the impact fees reimburse us? You called it a loan for a street program?
Yeah, the statutes do allow us to loan money from one fund to another in order to advance impact fee projects. And we could, if we were loaning to ourselves, our plan would be to use the future impact fee revenues to pay back that loan. When it comes to something like if we wanted to try to debt finance something that would be impact fee funded, it would be nearly impossible to finance it using the impact fees as the repayment source. It doesn't mean we couldn't use impact fees as a repayment source, but we would have to commit another source if we chose to debt finance.
But if we were to use cash, I'm thinking, let's just, for the example of the 8.2, we could take that 8.2 and use it into something that's impact fee that we would receive 2 or 3 years from now and pay that 8.2 back because it's one-time money, blah, blah, blah.
That's correct. We'd have to be very careful to identify it as a loan and report it as a loan in our financial statements and then report it on the annual impact fee report as a loan so that we could be very clear our intent was to use impact fees all along.
But it is possible.
Yes.
Okay. Then the last question. Geo bond debt forecast, your assumption slide. Because I've been confused now of how you've talked about what we've done and what we're going to do. The Geo bond debt forecast at $1.73 combined rate, is that the rate that we will experience in 17, or is that the rate that we're projecting we're gonna go up from the $1.60. I just don't know which one that was.
I believe it's the rate we would experience in the year that we would be making the debt service payments.
Yeah, that particular rate would be in fiscal year 18 before we achieved it. But in 17, we could, as Lori had shown you earlier, we could also borrow some money. The reason for that is there's some principal that falls off.
So the discussion that we had a month or so ago about changing that $1.60 self-imposed, this is the new rate. Is that what
This is the new rate that was discussed at that point when we got the property tax information, as Lori told you. We just wanted to show you graphically what that means.
Okay.
Doesn't change the CIP until you change it, of course.
Right, but then we weren't sure whether it was going to be $1.70, $1.78. Now we know it's $1.73.5.
Yeah, and that was the number that was on that slide as an estimate at the retreat, and so we've left that number there. Obviously, it's subject to any comments you may have.
Perfect, thank you.
Joe.
You got several of them again, so we're good. I like the fact again that we're setting aside money for the PIC, but in 19, $5 million drops off the ledge. The money we're typically now setting aside for one time, it goes away. Period. We don't have it for one time because it's got to go for debt service. My question is figuring in on your estimates, what is that impact of that $5 million in 19 going to be? Is it because you mentioned a certain 15% of our general fund money is part of the CIP? So I assume some of that's one-time money that's coming from construction sales tax and one-time funds, such as that $780,000 we're putting aside, which will be about $5 million come 19.
May I make one correction?
Sure.
Because I don't want to mislead you. The 15%, it's 15% of our CIP is funded with general funds. It's not that 15% of our general funds goes to the CIP.
I misspoke. That's what I meant to say. Okay. So with that being said, in $5 million disappears in 19. Have you taken a look to see what that impact may be on services moving forward that we would typically use that $5 million, assuming that we got our money from the Arizona Tourist and Sports Authority, which we probably won't. All right. How's that going to impact future one-time projects going forward as a result? Because that's a sizable amount of money that just goes away, and how that figures in your forecasting.
Yeah, I've moved to the slide with the one-time forecast. As you can see, when you get to FY19, there's a substantial reduction in the amount of one-time resources are available. We go from having 10 to 12 in the prior year to having 6 to 8 in the next year. So that's where the impact of the PIC set-aside hits. It reduces what's available for one-time purposes. And that's probably why the adopted CIP is lower in 19 than it was in 18, as we were planning ahead for when those one-time resources would go away.
So we're already anticipating that hit, so those projects have already been eliminated, or potential projects aren't showing up as a result of that. Okay.
Correct.
Is that a fair assumption? Okay. Second was, it would be very helpful to me when it comes time to the actual numbers of new money that we have, to have some type of a document, a one sheet, make it simple, call it an executive summary, that simply shows if we have $3 million, and I'm just throwing out numbers, I'm not saying you have $3 million, but say it was $3 million of new operating revenue. How does that break down in each category? $500,000 went to inflation, $500,000 or $780,000 went into the pot of money that goes for the sinking fund for the stadium PIC bond, and then another little slide as a result of we didn't have to use all of that money because the departments found in their base budgets $1 million worth of savings that did not have to go to future inflation or did not have to go for growth, et cetera. Does that make kind of sense? And if you could see a picture like that, I think it would be helpful really to everybody besides just the numbers, because that tells me by just looking at it what the demands for the pressures were in the categories of how that pie was broken up with all that new money. That would be very helpful.
We will work on that. We'll try to bring forward that, something like that with the supplemental discussion so that when you're ready to kind of look at those items.
That would be very helpful. My last one is on the bond rate. As everybody knows, the rate itself we charge is not where my focus has always been. It's been on the levy and the growth in the levy on the new, not the new construction, but the existing. So if somehow when we come in a proposed rate, I would like to know before voting on any type of bond is what is that impact as an increase in levy to the current residents? Because to me, rate is irrelevant. It's a mathematical calculation based on the assessed value and then based on the levy. The levy is key. Levy is what people pay. So if I could see that before we have any rate, that would ease my, any heartburn I have on any rates. Because to me, what should be driven is the particular project that you're doing, all right, and that impact on the levy increase, not a rate. Rate to me is irrelevant.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sherry?
They're covering most of the questions here. I have a question back on the container replacement. I think Bill brought it up. When we actually are replacing, although we're budgeting maybe for 1/5 of the containers, is it going to be something, I mean, I would hate to spend money to, like what Bill said, to replace something if it's still workable and it's still fine. I mean, is there something that like the citizen's going to say, my container's not good anymore, it's falling apart, or if we see it when we're collecting, how is that going to work? Because I'd hate to just replace and it's perfectly fine. Seems like a waste of money.
But it absolutely is, and I don't think that's anyone's intent in the program. The Finance Department and Public Works are working together with Public Works taking the lead on implementing a plan, which will include a person who's responsible for maintenance of the can inventory. And they will have criterion, so a wheel falls off of a can. You don't replace the can for a wheel falling off. Often you might just fix it right there, have them put it out curbside, they fix it curbside and move on. There's still an expense to it, but it's not the full cost of the can. And so there will be standards, it'll be in place as to where they will replace a can. You have to be careful because so many people would love to replace their can because they spilled something in it. And, that's a little bit different of a situation. They're working on those standards as well as how we're going to do it. It's July 1st this takes place. And at this point, I would say it's safe to say that the first year is going to be kind of a planned year, but also one where we're assuming the worst and we're seeing how things work out and then able to build even better long-term plans after truly implementing it for a year.
And that's good to hear. And I know like this 10-year contract, we've told several times that it seems awful long. And as we've sat here and see the escalation for the fuel every year, once we get and I know these are just preliminary numbers now, but once we get how much it's going to cost or what our plan is for the container replacement and then the decrease in the fuel, it'd be really great if we could lower the sanitation just a little bit, because I know a lot of the citizens see these fuel surcharges that just remain on airlines and delivery. And if there's something, if the numbers can work out, that I think that would be really great. It may not be a lot, but I think every little bit helps with the fuel going down. So I just would ask you to look at that if that's something that we can get done.
What I think I would like to, there are a couple of things within that. One is, as you'll notice, and I asked Lori to put this slide back up, there's an ending fund balance. What we're trying to do in this fund, like we do in the general fund, and we programmed for in our water, wastewater funds, is to have 90 days operating expenses as a cash reserve in that fund. Then beyond that, you don't program any additional balance going in. But I want to point out, probably for the benefit of the public, is that we've been absorbing rate increases for quite some time, and the City Council has made a very clear direction on that if we have to look at service levels, look at that first before an increase. And so what has happened is that, as you'll recall, there was a time not that long ago that we had weekly bulk trash pickup, and that is gradually reduced, and from my perspective anyway, relatively minor customer complaints, but that is because of the due diligence that you have put in that said, no, we can't let these rates get any higher. And I think what we can do to help a little bit to show all of that, and you're absolutely right as to monitoring those to make sure we aren't going too high, but we can also do a little bit of that of showing what the index is of our contract, which is such a huge percentage of our total revenue, and how that has changed over time on the cost per unit compared to what the rates have been, which haven't changed in that time frame.
And then I just have one more question really on slide 22. The impact fee funds forecast.
Doesn't want to go.
No,
Doesn't like 22.
Mine 22 says a project summary, fire, parks, police.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that one. Because we've had this conversation. We just had a lot of conversation about the fire. How much money is in the impact fees for these different areas, or do we not have that, or are we going to get that as it gets closer? Or?
Next week, there is a work session scheduled to discuss the fire by itself, and we'll have that information there. We really didn't want to add it at this point and add it to this conversation when you've got a dedicated
It was best
one.
because this conversation would have gone.
That's why I just wanted to know. I just wanted to
Perfect
know if we
timing
were
the
going
way
to
you're
get
doing
it.
Yeah, but I agree with her question. It's one of my questions too that come forth.
And then the police with the impact fee. My last question on this slide, and that's my last question, is it says the 23,000 square feet. Is that the building we're building now, or is that additional impact fees? I guess.
In the impact fee program, they have to make different kinds of assumptions. So in the case of fire, you can just say, well, you're going to build a station, you're going to build a station. Police, you weren't sure if you're going to build little community stations or a larger facility. So the way the plan was developed, it simply calculated the square footage of police space that would be required due to growth. And so it didn't designate it to a specific building or not. So the impact fees are being used on the current project, and there are also some programmed for the future phase 2 project as well.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if that was just all new 23,000 square feet or if it included what we're doing now. Okay, I'm good, thanks.
Got it? All right, no questions? So
They do a good job.
all right. Wally?
I have a real quick question. And Bill, I have had my can replaced because the truck came by with its arms and it squished it and put a hole in it. So when their truck does that to our cans, can we recoup from them rather than us having to pay for it?
My guess is probably not, in that that's an ordinary cost that you would expect to happen to some cans in any given year. The purpose of control of the cans at the end was that when you go out at the end of 10 years, or in this case in 2019 with your bid documents, if the city didn't own the cans and manage them at that point in time, it would give one vendor a competitive advantage over the others if they owned all the cans that said Goodyear. So that's part of the logic of why those were separated out to go away after 10 years.
But we could have that conversation in 19 if we wanted to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Well, don't forget it, please. Thank you.
We're putting it in the notes here.
Thank
city
you very
clerk.
much.
Point that way.
Yes.
Joanne?
You know, I have many, many questions, and I don't know if with the time and audience waiting, if I could certainly ask these afterwards.
Why don't you ask partial?
Okay. Well, quite a few have been hit upon, but back to sanitation. I would be curious just to see the past 5 years fund balance that's occurred. And, and I appreciated Vice Mayor Loretano's question about is it possible to lower some of the fees. At the same time, I understand how we have to be cautious. That seems like a healthy balance that we're looking at for the next 5 years. So I guess looking at is there possibility of lowering, looking at what has been the previous 5 years, but also looking at, okay, if it doesn't make sense to lower something because we don't expect it to last because of fuel prices and things like that, are there other things that we could be doing? Could we be having some other recycling opportunities, because we'd been doing it twice a year, maybe we could be doing it quarterly. I mean, are there other enhancements that we could do for a year or 2 years that we haven't been able to do in the past, just to make up for some of that stuff. So I'm curious about that. Is it possible that for businesses that we have a larger recycling container out there? You know, we used to have it at the community park there while we were going through the trial period of recycling. Those were awesome for businesses. Maybe we could pull that in for a couple years. I mean, so there's other things that, you know, maybe we could be doing in lieu of this. So that's kind of it on the contain. And thank you for all the other questions. The bill kind of hit upon the, I guess, concern of ongoing and some of the things that we as a council have been excited about in talking for capital campaigns, and that's, you know, the multi-gen, the park. You know, I would assume, and I'm pretty sure that we've looked at all of the funding for police ongoing because of the new facility, but we haven't had that conversation about fire, and we haven't had that conversation about the multi-gen. And so I'm glad to hear you're going to be bringing fire to us, but I think we need to hear pretty quickly about the multi-gen and what that looks like, because there's been some excitement brewing over that entity. Let's see. I'm trying to read my own notes. You know what? I'll get back to you on some of these others. But thank you for the presentation.
And just to clarify, the next time that you present like this, kind of let me know ahead of time, and we'll separate it, because I could understand with that. For the most part, though, we're going to stick with letting the presentations go before we ask the questions. But in this case, I think Bill's suggestion was good, and I noticed myself at the very beginning, I paused thinking, should I or shouldn't, but I thought, no, I got to give this a test and see how it goes. So that's the way it is.
I'm sorry, one more.
Yes, yes.
I switched my paper over. One last question. So going forward with we've had conversations about bonds, about where we are in certain level capacity in certain categories. When was the last time a bond committee, the Citizens Bond Committee, met to look at some of those levels that we're at? Because some of them are very low. And I'm wondering if it's time to bring that committee back to have that discussion.
That's a good question. We have some, you know, if I remember right, including water and sewer, about 170,000 of unused, unissued bond capacity, but not necessarily in the right areas. The last bond election we had was 2004. So the Citizens Committee met prior to that and leading up to that particular bond election.
Well, and that's, you know, I think it really triggers in my mind that we should be thinking about, you know, not that we're going out for the election, but I think the citizens need to look at the levels that we're at and say, you know, this is, if it's been 12 years since that's been looked at, it's.
But the capacity that we already voted on in 2004.
I'd have to look at what that specific election did. Yeah. That was in the headlines, if you will. I wasn't here at the time, but that was the first time that the ballpark was being looked at, and it was being looked at with the Angels, and the voters approved, which I've never seen before, but 10 million GO authority towards that. That was part of that election. There were several other things. Yeah, I can get a complete schedule of each election and what's left. We have that information.
It'd be good information.
We can send that in a weekly report or something.
Mayor, I'd also we'll add what we have the authority for based on previous elections. So we have quite a bit of authority for going out and selling bonds. It really comes down to what is our capacity for paying them back vis-a-vis the tax policy rate of about $1.60 combined. But that being said, there are times where it is absolutely good to get the committee back to, or a committee established again to look at future uses. But I would also encourage you to look at our existing authority as well, certainly, because there's quite a bit out there.
But I thought there was a couple of categories that was fairly low and light. And I'm just saying that's what I had noticed, and so I was wondering how the process went on looking at it. So
yes, we'll be able to provide that.
All right, we're going to adjourn this meeting, but is 10 minutes enough to break, or do you need a little bit more than that? Is that all right?
It's fine.
We have a break in between the meeting. So, okay, So why don't we just make it exactly 7 o'clock? That gives you enough time, all of you. This meeting's adjourned.
So